Joining us is Josh Meyer. He's part of an organization called American Legislative Exchange Council, limited government, free markets, federalism. And you guys just released a new study ranking the poorest versus the richest states in our nation. So tell us, Josh, what are your findings in this study?
California comes in 47th in this brand new edition of our report called Rich States, Poor States. We look at the policy factors that are impacting economic opportunity around the country. And when we look at California, California's past reminds me of that song, California Dreamin.
On such a winter's day.
Exactly. It used to be the place people from all around the country, New York, Chicago, Boston, they looked to California as this great bastion of opportunity, sort of the last great hope for the American dream. And what we've seen today with this policy turnaround and now ranking 47th, fourth from the bottom, is that there's a set of rules and regulations and taxes that make it really hard for people to succeed now. So instead of coming to California, people are actually leaving California.
When do you think this started, and what started this downturn in our state?
Well, it really goes back a number of decades to probably the 1960s, which is around the peak of California's growth. And ever since then, taxes and regulations have been increasing, and the state's growth has been slowing. But the COVID-19 pandemic was also a big turning point for the state, as it was for many other states, because when people realized they could live anywhere, work anywhere, move around the country and have a job, many people left a lot of these states like California and New York and Illinois that are imposing all these regulations and taxes for other states that have better taxes, better regulatory environments. They're better for business.
I read a study or a story over the weekend that said the year 2024 was the worst on record for Hollywood TV and film production in California, second only to 2020, obviously during COVID when nothing was going on. But studios are leaving California to go to Georgia or Tennessee or Texas because they just don't see that they can make a profit by doing production here in California. And that's sad because California for many, many decades has been known for the home of Hollywood TV and movies.
That's right. Yeah, I believe now Georgia is actually the top state for film production and spending, no longer California. It used to be that all the people were here, the social capital was here, and so this was all where the business of movie making took place in California. But of course, now you can set up a studio just about anywhere and do that production anywhere. And so Georgia, which ranks much higher in our report, 13th, is a great place for film production. A lot of places have found, and so they can move people there, and they can even work with people in California through virtual work and things. So you see, film is a great example of what happens when you set up this bad policy environment.
Wasn't Gavin Newsome trying to provide tax breaks for these movie studios and other incentives to keep production here in California? Has that not been working?
That does work around the margins and may have indeed a small impact. The problem that California is facing, though, goes much deeper. And there's a reason that it's not just the film industry that's leaving, but lots of business. I think back just to last year when Chevron, the big oil company, announced that it too was leaving California, and it's the latest in a long string. California has fundamental economic challenges that cannot be solved by one little carve-out for one specific industry.
Well, you just mentioned Chevron, and last week Valero announced that they're going to be shutting down their big refinery in the Bay Area as well. Do you think things like this that continue to happen will actually cause Californians to change the way that they're voting, or leadership in our government to start making changes? Because even, again, you can go back to in Los Angeles, they've put out all of 4 permits to rebuild homes after 10,000 buildings were destroyed. At some point, do you think Californians wake up?
I think people have to get tired of the way the economy is heading at some point. I look here that California has lost about 2.2 million people since 2013, leaving for the other 49 states. And that's a lot of people who just said, I'm tired of this. I can't deal with these taxes, with these regulations. I'm going to move to Arizona, to Utah, Idaho, Texas, one of these more competitive states. And the people who remain, too, are being hurt because there are fewer jobs available. There's less economic growth, less opportunity. It's harder to afford housing, harder to start a family. These are real challenges that people are facing, and sooner or later that political aspect is going to follow.
I was reading an article this morning, and it was talking about they were making a claim to watch the 2032 presidential race after the new census happens in 2030, because so many states like California are essentially shrinking, or at least not growing as quickly as other states. And it's just there can be a potential shift towards the right. Do you think that is something leaders in the state of California should be worried about, as like the deep blue state that we are? Is this going to cause the country to shift more right because more people are going to be in states like Texas and Florida?
Well, one of these dynamics as people move to Texas and Florida is that it changes the number of congressional seats and the number of electoral votes in each state. And so California lost electoral votes in the 2020 census. We expect that it will lose again more electoral votes in the 2030 census, and Texas and Florida are both slated to gain. And so what that means over the long term, as you said, is that the political dynamics are changing. California is becoming less important as people move to Texas and Florida.
Do you see that being a motivation for people in the state to start making shifts and maybe reduce taxes, reduce regulation? Because one of the big things about the state and inflation in general has been super high, crazy home prices. Like even in my neighborhood, it's crazy to me that people are paying as much as they are for homes in my neighborhood. Do you think the state and government starts to make changes just in order to try to save the state of California and to some degree save Democrats?
Absolutely, because we have seen in many other states around the country, some of the most recent ones being states like Ohio and West Virginia, that have had real economic troubles and struggled and shrank and lost people to the other states, lost businesses. And the state leaders in those two states, for example, have said, we're not going to let this keep happening. They've turned around the policy environment. They've reduced taxes for people. And they've actually started to see a real reversal of that trend.
Hey, Josh, stand by. So amongst the richest states in the nation, California ranks number 47. That's according to a new study by the American Legislative Exchange Council. We'll continue our conversation with Josh Meyer. What about the Silicon Valley? Doesn't that contribute to the growth of the economy in California? We'll continue our conversation coming up after a check into national headlines. It's The Morning Answer with Mike and Matt on AM 1380. We're continuing our conversation with Josh Meyer. He's with the American Legislative Exchange Council. They're all about limited government, free markets, federalism, and they just released a study of the richest and poorest states in the union. And guess what? California is number 47. So bottom of the list. But Josh, again, thanks for joining us this morning. What about the Silicon Valley, the birthplace of computers, the birthplace of Apple and the internet and social media? Isn't the Silicon Valley a positive contributor to the economy in California? Isn't it still thriving?
The tech sector is one of the few things holding California back from an even worse collapse. There are other states, Utah being a great example, Texas being another, where tech sectors are starting to grow, where all of the people and the talent that's going to these places is allowing new Silicon Valleys to pop up all around the country. And California will probably always have that strong sector. It's a question of whether it remains the only place in the country where that kind of industry exists, or will there instead be a future with many Silicon Valleys?
Okay, interesting. So maybe more talent out of Silicon Valley starts to move to places like Utah. So what else makes Utah the top of the list as the nation's richest state?
So Utah's success, Utah has been at the top of this ranking for 18 years straight. And that doesn't come because they just did one thing right once. It comes because each year policymakers are sitting down in Utah saying, how can we make the state more competitive, more attractive for people moving here, a better place to start a business, a better place to raise a family? And so they have continuously, year after year, reduced regulations, reduced the size of government, cut taxes. And so each year, more and more Americans are saying, I like what they're doing in Utah. I like the tax environment. I like the regulatory environment. So people are moving there. They're starting businesses there.
Now, something that I think is interesting, because you're talking about in Utah, they cut taxes, they cut regulation and things like that. But many people from places like California or Democrats would say it's like, but then, the environment is horrible. The air is dirty. You can't drink the water, all of these different things. How is Utah balancing the lack of regulations that allows business to thrive, but also protecting the environment? And is it a either or option? Because that seems to be what we're told in California is like, if you cut regulation, then corporations are just going to go out and pour nuclear waste into the river because they can.
Mm-hmm. It's not an either or at all. And California has shown itself to be an outlier, not just compared to Utah, but compared to the other 49 states. I think it's interesting to think about how much is each state spending. And you look at California, the state government spends about $7,200 per person in the state on state government. That is the most of any state in the country. Compare it to Utah at about $4,000 and Florida and Texas at both under $3,000. These are states that are spending, compared to their population size, less than half of what California does. And they're showing that you don't need to spend all this money. You don't need a government this expansive, this big, with this many regulations and employees and taxes in order to run a state in the 21st century and provide the core services of government.
How do you think tariffs impact the economy of California? Because obviously Trump, for the past number of weeks, if not months, has been advocating that we need to have a trade balance. And obviously that's going to impact businesses in the United States and California. And Gavin Newsome has said, well, we're going to counter that. What does Governor Gavin Newsome want to do to counter these tariffs? And will it help the economy here in California?
I think that regardless of which way the tariff battle goes, if there is, as the president wants there to be, a reshoring, a bringing back of manufacturing to America, those manufacturing jobs are not going to go necessarily back to the places where they've historically been. They're not going to go to Pennsylvania or to Illinois or to Michigan, to these uncompetitive states with lots of taxes and regulations. Those jobs are going to go to the states that are competing, that are reducing taxes, making it easy to run a business and to hire people. And so those jobs aren't going to go to those places they were before. They're going to go to Arizona, to Utah, to Georgia. These are the competitive states that businesses are looking to for investment in America.
What do you think if, let's just assume Governor Newsom is listening right now and he's like, okay, you make a good point. I want to make changes. What do you think are some immediate changes the state of California could make to become more competitive, to move from 47 to, say, like mid-20s, or move up the list at least a little bit? Because we're not going to
top
be
half. We're shooting for top half.
Well, as much as I might like to say we should just get rid of all taxes immediately, we, of course, live in reality, and we have a state government with a budget that needs to be balanced. And so where you start seeing some improvement, or you could start seeing some improvement, is take the energy that inspired the Department of Government Efficiency led by Elon Musk at the federal level and bring that to California, and really take a careful look at all the things that we're spending money on. Figure out, what can we reduce? What are things that are currently done by government that government doesn't need to do at all? How can we save money on expensive entitlement programs? And then take some of that savings and pass it along to taxpayers. Reduce your income tax rates, cut spending, and put the savings back in the pockets of taxpayers. And that is the recipe from rich states to poor states for economic growth.
Now, something that Newsom would never admit this yet, that he's running for president in 2028, though he seems to be doing it based off his podcast and all the other many things that he's doing. Do you think as a whole that the country looks to California and by extension, Gavin Newsome, who's been our governor for the last several years, and think to themselves like, yes, I want that across the rest of the country? Or do you think people look at California, hear what's going on, and run away as fast as you can?
Thankfully, I don't even need to guess. I know that people don't look to California as a model anymore. Again, look at the 2.2 million people who've left the state just since 2013. Those are 2.2 million people who've lived in California and said, I can't do this anymore, right? We see all around the country, people are voting with their feet. They're leaving some states and going to others. And all of that voting is really a referendum on how well each state is doing at running its economy. And so people are leaving California. They're rejecting the California model. They're instead moving to Utah, to Idaho, to Texas, to Florida, these other states that have set up more competitive economies that are growing and allowing people to work and support their families.
When Mike and I drive into work and traffic is light, we just automatically assume, okay, it must be a state holiday, because 1 in 5 here in Sacramento work for the state, work in government. And it's such a huge part of the economy here in Sacramento.
Yeah.
But even as a state, we're very pro-union. We've got a lot of unions within the state. Do you think that is one of the problems with the economy in California?
Absolutely. You look at where companies are investing, especially for the future of manufacturing in America, and they are rejecting states that don't provide the right to work, as California does not provide the right to work. And you look at a company like Boeing that is rejecting its historic home in Washington, a state that does not have right to work, and is instead investing in new facilities in South Carolina that allows right to work, gives workers the choice of whether they want to be in a union or not.
Yeah, and I feel like the amount of power that unions have in the state of California makes it really difficult to be able to do business. And it seems like we've lost so many companies that have gone to Texas and other states because of those kinds of issues. Just labor costs in California are just so exorbitant.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of even small businesses close their doors because of the increase in minimum wage. Because I've seen it personally with friends that I know. It's just so hard, almost impossible for these small mom and pop shops to pay such a high minimum wage to the employees and not lose money.
Yeah, there are two policies here that really impact small businesses. One you mentioned is the minimum wage. California has the second highest minimum wage of any state in the country. And the other is the top personal income tax rate, which California has the third highest in the country, because many small businesses, sole proprietorships, partnerships, things like that, pay their taxes as personal income taxes. So those two policies really hurt the state of California.
Well, and something along the lines with minimum wage, because like, what is it? It's $20 an hour for fast food workers, which is crazy because that's actually more than the minimum wage for most other businesses.
Do you know what I saw in the drive-thru at Panda Express yesterday?
What?
There was a sign where you could make $100,000 plus potential by working at Panda Express.
Crazy. But Josh, I'm just thinking about minimum wage. What is the argument that states like California use to be able to push the minimum wage, knowing that like examples in Seattle and different things like that, where they pushed the wage up so high that businesses were closing and leaving the state, and now their tax revenue is actually lower than if they would have kept the minimum wage lower?
Yeah, I think they really have a misunderstanding of how the economy works. And the way I would explain it to them is that there is not one minimum wage. There really are two. There is the minimum wage set by the government, and there's the minimum wage that exists just in the free market. And we look in our report around the country, and we see many, many states that just set the minimum wage at the federal floor of $7.25 an hour. And what we find in those states is that not many people are actually making $7.25 an hour. If you look around in Utah, you don't see any jobs advertising wages like that. The reason is that these states have built competitive economies where businesses are competing for workers. And so the market minimum wage is much higher than the one set by the government. Now, if you just look at the world and you think the only way to change things is to do it through the government, then you end up with the California model, where you raise the minimum wage higher and higher, and you actually eliminate jobs. You put people out of work, you put small businesses out of business, and you just end up with a smaller number of people who are making that higher minimum wage.
The other thing that keeps coming up along with minimum wage is rent control in states like California, which we already have such a huge housing crisis, even more so in places like LA after the fires that burned down so many homes. It seems like that doesn't make any sense. It discourages builders and developers from building. How does California address keeping housing prices and rent prices within reason, but also allow businesses and developers to be able to grow?
Well, you're exactly right that rent control is an incentive against more construction. Why would somebody build, for example, a new apartment building when they know that rent controls are going to reduce the amount of money or potentially eliminate any profit they could make from that investment? Instead, the way is to really embrace the free market, get government regulations out of the way, get state regulations out of the way, make it easier for businesses and developers to increase the supply of housing. And in the marketplace, housing will get cheaper.
Well, Josh, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you for joining us this morning. Josh Meyer, he's with the American Legislative Exchange Council, right here on The Morning Answer with Mike and Matt, AM 1380, and online at am1380theanswer.com.